Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of The Riley Lewis Show. I'm your host, Riley Lewis. We have a lot of news to get into, so let's just get started. So, some stuff that you might have missed over the weekend. We begin with a story about the thousands of American citizens who gathered in the streets last Friday in celebration of the holiday Juneteenth, which officially marks the end of the practice of slavery in the United States. Juneteenth is the anniversary that, again, marks the day in 1865 on June 19th in which the last held slaves in the United States, specifically in the state of Texas, were freed. The war was over, all slaves were freed. Predictably, or as you might understand, Juneteenth is especially important this year, as America is really grappling with the legacy of systemic racism and systemic injustice, and as that really is the sort of backdrop politically for the year 2020, Juneteenth takes the spotlight as it should in many ways. Now, the Juneteenth demonstrations took on many different forms, including virtual gatherings, including car caravans, and other forms of gathering or congregation. According to Reuters, these celebrations really do appear to showcase the traditions and heritage of the holiday as really a great day of liberation for African American people. I apologize about that. There are other additional overtones, by the way, though, as this year really does, this year's holiday, like I was just saying, is particularly important because it follows a string of police killings, police brutality incidents, and a lot of different protests about the government and abuse of authority, period. So this year is a really, really important year for Juneteenth, especially as we are just coming past the memorial of Breonna Taylor, the memorial of George Floyd, the memorial of Rayshard Brooks. These are all really, really important high-profile cases, and they're really all just highlighting the importance of Juneteenth. Now, organized movements in recent weeks, or I should say, some organized movements in recent weeks have even gone as far as to make calls for the abolition of law enforcement. Which, again, is in the motive is to highlight police brutality, to fight for justice, and to fight for equality. But sometimes these movements do, I guess what I should say is sometimes these movements are really good in the sense that they seek justice and peace. But as I've mentioned before, peace and justice are two terms that are universally understood but not universally defined. And within these movements, there are some actors that are much more revolutionary. Some are implicitly revolutionary. Some are explicitly revolutionary. Some aren't even revolutionary. It would be inappropriate to say that. Some just want chaos. But I do want to focus on most of the people who are not reactionary, but actually, taking a step forward in solidarity with the brothers and the sisters, that we have in this country as one big family. And it's rightful in this year, and really in all years, to demand justice. I've said this before, and I'll say it again, but a threat to justice anywhere is really a threat to justice everywhere. So I think that this is really good. This is actually quite American, in my opinion. This is what we should do in this country. This is what we do in this country that makes this country something special. When we see something that is unjust, we fight until it is just. We don't have the media cover up for it. We have journalists go investigate. We have people like Brian Stevenson, Father Greg Boyle. We have actors on the ground, grassroots actors that are investigating, that are creating change in their communities, and that are really striving toward justice. So this is something that in this country, in the spirit of America, we take justice into our own hands when the government fails to provide it. Now, in addition to celebrations across the nation, which again are going from city to city, coast to coast, sea to shining sea, right? Los Angeles to Atlanta to New York, there are also several large corporations who have declared Juneteenth to be a paid holiday, which is really a great step forward towards solidarity, especially racially speaking. Several senators have also proposed legislation to make Juneteenth a federal holiday, which would be remarkable. This is exactly the sort of solidarity that we really do need in this union, because we all need to be united together. And this is a good step forward that's going to unite us, I think. Now, we see some of the largest gatherings, I should say, in the city of Atlanta, where Rayshard Brooks was recently shot and killed by a police officer. in a Wendy's parking lot. I apologize for blanking on the officer's name. Following it was Garrett Rolfe, which basically who was in an altercation with this person, Richard Brooks, who was at the wheel, falling asleep at the wheel of his vehicle. Anyway, you can read about the story online, I'm sure. The point is, Atlanta has been a hot spot, particularly. Let's even go back to the two teenagers, or I should say, two college students, who were on their way back in Atlanta, who were on their way back home from a police brutality rally, basically, to end it and spread awareness. And there was tape caught of the police officers proceeding to break into their car, to tase them, to harass them, and you heard screaming and yelping, and it was really terrible. So Atlanta's really been a hot spot this year, and so predictably a lot of the largest celebrations for Juneteenth were going on in Atlanta. In short, this really has been the most difficult year, at least in my living memory, for race relations in the United States. I'm only 23 years old, but in my entire life, I think this has been the most tender, most hostile, most politically charged year for race relations and maybe politics in my entire lifetime. But in any case, Juneteenth really is in the national spotlight, as it must be now, more than ever, as we try to move forward to racial equality and justice overall. Now, when Reuters asked Antonio Parks, who was one of the marchers in downtown Atlanta, Parks had this to say about civil rights in the United States, quote, "We still feel the pain of slavery. It's not healed and won't be until we're treated the same." The Reuters article, which is true, I think, and the Reuters article also quotes another marcher or demonstrator, Maxwell. I'm not sure how to say his last name, Owasanya, who basically had this to say, quote, "African American history is American history. Black history is American history. We need to be heard. We need people to see us. We need people to be we need to be understood. We need to be seen as equal." All of those things are, number one, very reasonable, and number two, they're reasonable because they're promised in the U.S. Constitution. Of by and for the people, we are all created equal under God, one country united. So asking for the Constitution to apply to you is nothing more than in the spirit of the founders and the sons and daughters of liberty. And I really do think that this is a good example of thousands of people in the streets with signs, people virtually gathering, people on social media discussing this holiday and talking about history and the American Civil War. And I think that this is the start of a newfound racial harmony and hopefully political harmony in the United States overall. Moving on, though, to something that is not really all that harmonious, but still very important and definitely politically charged and partisan, the Supreme Court has ruled that the President Trump, cannot immediately end the DACA program, which protects approximately 700,000 children from deportation, children who were brought here as young children and basically were raised here. Now, this has really been a controversial topic for American liberals and American conservatives. The termination of the DACA program really is something that's a hot button issue. It was one of several key promises that the president made on his campaign trail in 2016, in addition to a large border wall that Mexico would pay for, at least in part. So the president really has made immigration and border security one of his top priorities and one of his top talking points. And so this has really become a very politically charged issue in the last few years, although even additionally under Barack Obama, it still was pretty politically charged. In any case, moving on, so the Supreme Court basically ruled on last Thursday, that DACA, or the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, cannot immediately be ended for the president's listed reasons, which is really important to understand there because the operating clause there is for his listed reasons, meaning the president does have the constitutional authority to start a program, just like Obama did, and to end the program by executive order. However, Chief Justice John Roberts basically said that the president has really not supplied any sufficient reasons to do so, and so the court did not agree with the president's plan of action, basically. And again, the crux of the issue is really the acronym or that phrase, deferred action. The good thing about this term is that it's clear enough to shield legally migrant children who don't have any legal or civil status from deportation, and that's a good thing. However, the trouble with this term is the fact that there is no standard for deferred action. There's no legal standard. There's also no established timeline, so we don't know for how long action is deferred, and we don't know what action happens when the deferment time runs out. Now, Chief Justice Roberts, who wrote the majority opinion, which is interesting because he is a Republican that was appointed by George W. Bush, so I should make note of that. This was a 5-4 decision with 4 Democratic Supreme Court Associate Justices, and then the Chief Justice John Roberts, who is a Republican, who did also vote in favor of Obamacare. So I have to say, I hope that assuages some people's fear that the court will go this way or that way immediately, because really it's actually a much more mixed bag. In any case, this is what Chief Justice Roberts had to say about the decision, quote, "We do not decide whether DACA or its rescission are sound policies." Roberts added, quote, "We address only whether the agency complied with the procedural requirement that it provided so we address only whether the agency complied with the procedural requirement that it provide a reasoned explanation for its action." In other words, they're basically saying that Donald Trump is not providing a reasoned explanation for the action of ending or terminating the DACA program, gradually or altogether all at once. And this basically, again, means that the president can end the program. Any president has the authority to end any executive order. However, Roberts is saying that there really is no reasoned explanation for the answer, and I think that that's interesting. Now, one of the other problems or one of the other things that is important to talk about with DACA is that it really only provided originally a 24-month deferment plan, or 2 years, with no real procedure for gaining citizenship. So again, it's like the problem was, okay, so we've deferred action, but how long do we defer the action for, and what is the action? That's the problem, and that's why we're even in this predicament to begin with. And this really makes for something of a quagmire for those who have arrived in the United States as children. Those kids have grown up here, gone to school here, learned to live here, but they don't have any legal or civil status in the country. And furthermore, the political tension around DACA is not really all that surprising, considering that we are dealing with children. And that's always one that touches close to the heart, right? Like what person with a heart wants to look at an innocent child and just turn them down? And our children are the future, and I really do want the United States to be a safe place to live for everybody, and I want this to be the best place to live for everybody. Including the millions and millions of immigrants who arrived here in the 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th, and will arrive in the 21st century. This really is a nation built on ideas that people from around the world want to promote and subscribe to. The most American thing about this country is that we come from all over the world, but we can agree on common values and ideals. And I should say, but anyway, back to DACA. For many, the DACA program really does seem, again, as simple as taking care of children and families, because what person with a heart doesn't want to just take care of children and families and feed them and clothe them and let them have a really, really good life? I want every child to have the kind of wonderful childhood that I did. However, as I've said in previous episodes, I do find it a little concerning when the Supreme Court effectively decides to pass legislation because the do-nothing Congress is unable to, quote, meet the needs of the moment, borrowing that from Kamala Harris. And I really do find it rather striking that the mere notion, even also, by the way, of border security and traditional sovereignty is unusually provocative in the United States. Border security is a topic that is discussed explicitly all over the world, including in Canada, China, Japan, Israel, Australia, Iran, Iraq, Sudan, North Korea, South Korea, and on down the list. And my point is, we have to find a way to be able to talk about secure borders, which is something that every other country talks about. We have to be able to talk about a path to citizenship that is legal and streamlined, and we also have to talk about, at some point, do we grant amnesty or not? Now, again, which brings me to another point. This ruling does not really. I think this ruling is almost basically granting temporary amnesty, which I'm not. Which I think is interesting. It's just that don't backdoor amnesty, either grant amnesty or don't grant amnesty, but this sort of weird deferred action bubble where we don't know what to do and when to do it, and we don't know who's legal and for how long and for where they can live. It's all too confusing. So, and for example, by the way, Ronald Reagan even granted amnesty to well over 1 million immigrants in the 1980s. So this really can be something that is bipartisan. So I don't believe that the do nothing Congress has to be do nothing. I think they want to be do nothing because I don't really know that they totally actually care. Now, as we wind things down with this story, it's important to hear what the president's alleged reason is for ending the DACA program, just, to be responsible here. So according to the New York Times, President Trump has previously said that enacting or maintaining the DACA program really is beyond the power of the presidency, which is an interesting argument you could make. However, the Republican Chief Justice, John Roberts, accompanied by 4 other Democratic Supreme Court justices, those persons being Sonia Sotomayor, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Elena Kagan, and Stephen Breyer, following the court's decision in a 5-4 decision, President Trump wrote the following on Twitter, quote, "Do you get the impression that the Supreme Court doesn't like me?" And considering Chief Justice Roberts, the fact that Chief Justice Roberts claimed that Trump's reasons basically were arbitrary and capricious, I do start to get the impression a little bit that the Supreme Court does not like the president. And it wouldn't surprise me considering the president wanted to, he ran on this idea of draining the swamp, and now he's got to work with all those people in the swamp. And I think that really, if I went a step further, I would say that it's pretty noted that many political figures in Washington and all over this country have openly expressed their personal outrage or distaste or disdain with the Trump administration on a regular basis. So this is not really a secret. So I do think that on one hand, the Supreme Court can make a decision. On the other hand, I also think that the Supreme Court can be biased. I don't think that those are perfect people. I don't think the justices on the Supreme Court are unable to make a mistake or infallible. I do think they let personal politics get in the way. And I do think if it was a different president asking for this, that maybe it would be a different result. I do think that some of this does have to do with the president. To be fair, when you look at his behavior, he does really make it difficult to want to get along with him. But in any case, none of that should really be influencing our policies and the law and the Constitution. Also, I should note that the Supreme Court has previously denied the president's request to add the citizenship question to the census. You may have remembered this from a couple of years ago when the president wanted to add a citizenship question to the census, which, by the way, it was covered in the media as completely racist, completely terrible. Number one, it used to be done in this country. Up until 1950, we used to do that. Number two, it's an incredibly common practice that is recommended by the United Nations. So if you're saying that practice is racist, you're saying the United Nations is racist. And number three, many, many, many other nations, including Canada, Mexico, Ireland, Germany, and Australia have the citizenship question on their census as the UN recommends. So I really do not think that this is any sort of a racially motivated terrible thing. But in any case, the court really has repeatedly pretended that this president is overstepping his boundaries when he either enforces laws that are already on the books, such as border security, or when he really requests a measure that is conducted in several other modern, liberal, open-minded countries, even including Canada, Mexico, Ireland. Now, according to the New York Times, Justices Clarence Thomas, Samuel Alito, and Neil Gorsuch wrote the dissenting opinion for the decision. Those are 3 of the 4 conservative justices, or I should say 3 of the 5, along with John Roberts. I'm blanking on the 5th. Justice Clarence Thomas wrote of the ruling, quote, "Today's decision must be recognized for what it is, an effort to avoid a politically controversial but legally correct decision." And that is true. It is politically and maybe even culturally controversial, but it was not legally incorrect what the president was asking. And that's really the difficult thing to understand, and that's really even hard to say and to hear. But I guess my point is that we don't like the laws. We should not be fighting them in the Supreme Court. We should be trying to change them in the Congress. Now, Justice Thomas continued to say, quote, "The court could have made clear that the solution respondents seek must come from the legislative branch," meaning if you want to get the law changed, go to Congress, not the Supreme Court. Now, again, because this is about legislation and lawmaking and policy, not litigation. And there's a big difference between legislation and litigation. In any case, I really do think we're starting to see a very dangerous pattern of behavior from the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court really, since its birth, in my opinion, has just completely given itself an increasingly amount of power. It just invented judicial review, and I believe 1803 from Marbury v. Madison, the Supreme Court is now just legislating because presidents make campaign promises, and then people want to fight them in court when really we should just be doing this in Congress. And I really do think it's dangerous because our laws must be determined by our elected officials. That's the difference also that we don't talk about between the Congress and the Supreme Court. Everyone in Congress, whether or not you like them, was elected. No one on the Supreme Court bench was elected. They were appointed by a president. So the president was elected by delegates and in the electoral college. So that's who you vote for, who then vote for the president, who then appoints somebody, who's then confirmed by the Senate to sit on the bench. So we have unelected officials with lifetime terms dictating our legislation. I think that's incredibly scary. I don't think there's anything democratic about it, and I really do think that it should be our job in Congress, the people, to create and or amend laws when we see fit. In any case, we're going to move on to a little story here about something a little less charged, but still very interesting. Something interesting in the culture war saga, as Facebook and Zuckerberg really do, suffer some more internal tension. I should really say that, by the way, I know that this is a lot to start the week off with, but I should say that I want to move on to our final piece. Joe Scarborough has an opinion piece at the Washington Post, and the headline reads, quote, "Zuckerberg says he's disgusted by Trump's rhetoric. It's just crocodile tears." And I want to mention that I really do think that it's incredibly destructive to say that somebody doesn't have any character because Zuckerberg wants to, A, be a person who disagrees with the president, but also be a person who runs a platform where freedom of speech reigns supreme, one of the founding American ideals, one of the ideals that attracts millions and millions of people from around the world. Absolute freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom of religion, freedom of association, freedom of assembly. So I really think that this article is just a personal hit piece against Zuckerberg because, in the media, if you don't stand up to Trump, well, then you're really seen as, not a good person. And I think that this is exactly what's going on. And at this rate, we're basically going to take each other out, in my opinion, long before climate change ever has the chance to do so. And I really don't, I also think, by the way, that we should expect more from our journalists, but in any case, there is an interesting piece by Joe Scarborough at the Washington Post in which he really does heavily criticize Zuckerberg about his aloofness overall, especially about malpractice, deceptive activity on his platform, meddling, bot accounts. This even goes all the way back to the Cambridge Analytica case, in which the data and the personal information of millions and millions of maybe well over 100 million Facebook users was breached, and Zuckerberg had to testify before the Congress about that and about fact-checking. And I really think that we're sort of in this very weird legal situation where I think people are starting to confuse social media platforms for publications, and I think Zuckerberg's point is he's not an editor, he runs a social media platform. So if someone jumps on Facebook and says something that's inaccurate or not fully accurate or, should be, or is, a talking point, or is even just completely made up on the spot, it's not Zuckerberg's job to go around and read through Snopes and fact check everybody that ever makes a post on Facebook. He runs a social media platform. He's not a news editor. And that's basically the difference in mindset between, at this point, Jack Dorsey and Mark Zuckerberg. Mark Zuckerberg says, I run a social media platform. I'm not an editor. And that's his stance. And I honestly really do respect that stance. And I think that the media is going to keep going crazy because they really just want to silence voices that they don't like. But number one, I don't think that people are entitled to live in a world in which they never have to hear something that's either BS or something that isn't BS, they just disagree with it. And many, many times there are people who just disagree with something that is true, and so they say it's BS. So I think that it's really smart of Zuckerberg to not try to take on that role and pretend like he has even the power to be able to do that. He has millions and millions, tens and hundreds of millions of users around the world who make posts every single day. It would be an impossible task. It'd be like finding one needle in 3 million haystacks. So it'd be an impossible task. That said, that concludes today's episode of The Riley Lewis Show. I really appreciate you guys hanging in there with me, and I really appreciate you letting me be partially your source of news. You should go to lots of different sources of news. I should not be your only source, but I really appreciate the time that we spend together. If you like my content and you want to support me and support my channel, please hit that subscribe button down below. It's really big and you cannot miss it. You can also like this video, give it that thumbs up. You can also leave me a comment section leave me a comment in the comment section down below. Let me know how I'm doing. Let me know if you agree, if you disagree, if you're in between, to what extent, and why. I want to hear what you guys are thinking. Also, you can visit the link in the description to my Patreon page where you can sign up, become a member, and then make a donation to me. Also, you can find The Riley Lewis Show on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and Anchor.fm at anchor.fm/Riley-M Lewis, where you can also go to my virtual wallet and make a donation to support me there. I'd really appreciate your time and your support. I do want to thank you for your time and your support today. You've been listening to The Riley Lewis Show, and I will see you here again tomorrow.